All right, hello and welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today for our Livable Future Live event, the economic costs of food monopolies. So today we are going to be hearing from our research expert and one of our organizers to hear more about this issue of food monopolies. So we'll be discussing what it means, trends in consolidation of food production and where and how food is sold, and the impacts that has on us as consumers and on our environment. At Food and Water Watch, we're working toward a future with safe, sustainable food for all. And there's a lot of great work being done to transform our food system for the better. And that's work that you make possible. So thank you all so much for being here today. Before we get started, just a couple of quick things. First up, I have some helpful Zoom reminders. So the chat box is open, so you can use that to introduce yourself and share where you're joining from today. And it's also where we'll share some links during the event, so be sure to keep an eye out there for those. If you need to turn on closed captioning to add subtitles to your screen, you can click on the live transcript button in your Zoom toolbar to turn those on. And we will also have time for Q&A at the end of our discussion. So please use the Q&A box to send in any questions you have for our speakers. And finally, I am recording this event, so I will share the link to that with everyone who RSVP'd later this week, along with any of the links that we share in the chat today. So for those of you who may be new here, welcome. This event is part of Livable Future Live, which is Food and Water Watch's monthly virtual education series. So we meet here online once a month to cover different topics. And so you can see our next two events in the series will be on June 15th, why low carbon fuel won't solve the climate crisis, where we'll be talking about California's new low carbon fuel standards and some of the greenwashed policies in it that are enabling polluters to pay to pollute to the harm of frontline communities. So we'll hear from activists in California and across the country about some of the real climate solutions that we're fighting for. Then on July 20th, we'll be talking about how we can work together to protect manatees. They are under threat from seasonal algae blooms, which kill off their primary food source, and the main culprits are factory farm runoff and increasingly warm waters from power plants along the coast. So you can join us in July to hear from some experts about how we can work together to stop those problems at the source and protect manatees. We also have a couple of exciting pop-up events happening in the next few weeks. So next Wednesday, we'll be talking about a clean energy future for the United States and the European Union. The crisis in Ukraine has brought the need for European energy independence to the forefront of international conversations. And this is really a pivotal moment for us to fight hard for the transition to clean renewable energy. So you can join us next Wednesday to hear from US and European elected officials, youth and frontline activists, and we'll also have a special message from actor and environmental advocate Mark Ruffalo. So I encourage you to sign up to join us for that. And finally, June 1st through 15th, you can join me and Food and Water Watch for our Walk the Talk Challenge. Everyone has the power to be a climate champion, and that's why, as part of this challenge, we're asking you to dedicate 15 minutes a day for 15 days to protecting our planet. So every day you can choose to spend those 15 minutes either walking or taking action. So when you register, we'll send you a challenge checklist with a list of actions you can do during those 15 days. And it'll be a fun way to get active and get loud, and you get to do it with hundreds of other activists, and we'll all be part of a Facebook group together where we can share photos of what we're doing over the course of those 15 days. So you can sign up at the link that we'll put in the chat, and I hope that you'll join me for this. All right, so many of you here today are members of Food and Water Watch. So as you know, we work to mobilize people and communities to build political power so that we can fight for the solutions we need to protect our food, our climate, and our water. And I want to thank all of our members and volunteers who are here today for your incredible support in our campaigns, including our work to stop factory farms and mega dairies and invest in a more sustainable system that provides safe, healthy food for all. It's your support that lets us invest in these long-term fights. So if you're moved to make a donation today, you can do so at the link that we'll put in the chat or by texting the word gift to the number 23321. All right, so the basis for today's conversation is 3 new research reports on the issue of food monopolies, how our food is produced, where it's sold, new trends that we're seeing, and the ways that we're working for a more equitable and sustainable system. So the 3 reports are: first, the grocery cartels, then the hog bosses, particularly looking at Iowa, and finally, a look at lab and plant-based meats and whether they're actually as sustainable as they claim to be. So I'm sure that many of you know that Food and Water Watch has an incredible research team that regularly publishes on issues like this, as well as on climate and water policy. And this type of research is critical to educating elected officials and other key decision makers. And in partnership with our organizing team and the support of members like you, we're able to use this type of data and research to fight for the policy changes that we need to reform our food system. We published all of this research on our website so that you and other members can access them and dive deeper into these issues. So we'll share the link to our online research directory in the chat, and we'll also share the links to the 3 specific reports I just mentioned. And so now I'm going to welcome some of our guests to the stage who are going to dive a little bit deeper into these topics with me. So joining me for this conversation are Amanda Starbuck and Emma Schmidt. Amanda is our research director who oversees our team of dedicated researchers, and Emma is our senior Iowa organizer, and she lives in rural Iowa and has been with Food and Water Watch since 2018. So welcome. Thank you both so much for being here today for this conversation.
Anywhere else?
Awesome. Well, let's dive right in. We have been hearing a lot in the news lately about inflation and rising prices, gas for one, homes, food, and how it's really been hitting people hard. There are a number of factors that play into this, of course, like the pandemic and the invasion of Ukraine, which we'll touch on in a little bit. But specifically for rising food prices, there has been a systematic consolidation of our food system over the past 30 years that has really led to where we are today. Amanda, do you want to set the stage and tell us a little bit more about this?
Yeah, I think looking over the past 30 years really is the correct timeline, 30 to 40 years. We have in our country a very robust and beautiful legacy of antitrust. You go back, 100 years or so, and our government was very keen on breaking up big conglomerates among the meat industry, later on even in the supermarket industry. We, for instance, dissolved some of the biggest meat companies and broke back their power. In the 1930s and 40s, we pushed back against a big supermarket chain that was really kind of gouging consumers and retailers and such. But corporations have always fought back against any kind of checks to their power because they know that if their market share grows and grows and grows, they have a lot more leverage on what they charge consumers, how much they pay workers, and even what kind of safety standards they can follow or not. And so when you look back about 40 years ago in the 1980s, there was really a shift in our universities and our court systems and our federal government from being anti-bigness to being more embracing this myth of economic efficiency. That is that a larger corporation just is going to be more economically efficient and better for everybody. Well, this myth, which is really a lie, let's face it and be honest here, was perpetuated by corporations who worked very closely with government officials, academics and stuff to really kind of push this mantra. And what followed was, a decade of deregulation, sometimes called Reaganomics. And this was not, unique. It took root within the Reagan administration, but we saw it manifest itself as well in the Clinton administration, even the Obama administration. We saw, for instance, under Obama's tenure, even though his administration talked a big talk on agricultural antitrust, we saw some of the largest mega mergers happen within the agricultural industry, including the big Bayer-Monsanto merger, another one between Kraft Heinz, giving those conglomerates huge amount of power. So yeah, we have really fallen far from our roots of antitrust within this country, and we are seeing the results today.
Mm-hmm. And Emma, as Amanda touched on, this consolidation is also true on the production side, and the hog industry in Iowa is a telling example. Would you give us a little bit of background on what's been happening there?
Yeah, sure. Amanda really laid out all the facts. I did try bribing her not to, so I could seem like the smart one, but that's fine. I guess I will just try to have to impress you all with my handsome good looks instead. No, as a lifelong rural Iowan, I can share what those facts look like in reality. So like Amanda said, if we go back to, the 1960s, the 1970s, my community had a lot going for it. We were still a small town, right? We aren't known as the Golden Buckle on the Corn Belt for no reason, but we had local businesses. Our main street was bustling with a dress shop, a bowling alley. We had a hotel and a drive-in movie theater. And a lot of these businesses were prosperous because we had a strong agricultural economy to sustain them. By the time I came along in the 90s, all of that had pretty much gone. And it's continuing to disappear. Our schools have consolidated, our businesses have closed, and we're essentially left with a Dollar General, 2 bars, and a handful of churches. Of course, some of that can be attributed to an unnamed individual committing insurance fraud by intentionally blowing up his own gas station and taking a couple other buildings with it. But mostly it's because of the systemic consolidation of our food system. Our businesses and our people have gone because the economic opportunities just don't exist anymore. Despite agriculture being, our driving economic force, the system is now in the hands of so few people that we've seen a mass exodus of folks leaving in search of better opportunities, of a more promising future. And I think it largely comes down to how we're running our farm system. Instead of the small farms that my parents and my grandparents grew up with, where a farmer might raise a few hundred hogs, we're now seeing one farmer raise thousands of hogs. Instead of seeing homesteads and the idyllic red barns, our countryside is dotted with these long metal industrial hog confinements. In my county alone, we have over 200 factory farms that have absolutely taken over our community and funneled that money that was once put into local businesses into the hands of these ever-growing multinational corporations, which I know that all kind of paints a bleak picture, but that's why we're all here, right? We can and we will fight to change it so that the current and future generations can continue to call this place home.
Exactly. Yeah. Thanks so much for sharing that perspective and the impact that that's had on your community. And really just to go a little further, more recently, the pandemic has really exacerbated these effects of this increasingly consolidated market. And in the last couple of months, the crisis in Ukraine. Would you both share a little bit about what some of those impacts have been more recently?
Yeah, I think the pandemic is really a telling example that has pulled back the curtain on, the system, which again, this myth of it being more efficient, it is actually very much not resilient to any kind of shock and disruption. We saw early on the pandemic, there were these giant slaughterhouse facilities. We used to have, thousands of slaughterhouse facilities across the country, smaller ones that, served their local communities. Well, now we have these large consolidated ones far away from most farms. And one of them closed down, forced to close down, let's be real, because of their workers sickening and dying from the pandemic. And just closing one facility took off 4% of all hog processing within the entire country. And so consumers are facing exorbitant prices because, the corporations were using this to an advantage to jack up the price of meat. Farmers were killing their herds before they could even bring them to market and losing lots of money. Meanwhile, Tyson actually raked in record profits in 2020 and paid their executives handsomely. So they actually, profited off of this, this so-called shortage, which we'll talk about very soon here. And so the system might sound like it's broken, but really it's operating exactly as intended by these big corporations.
Yeah, thank you. So just to take this a little bit further, you mentioned how these corporations are, really taking advantage of this system that they've designed. And one of the things that we are doing at Food and Water Watch is really trying to hold those corporations accountable and looking out for the best interests of everyday people like us. So I want to bring on a special guest to join us momentarily. Emily Miller is one of our staff attorneys. And last year, Food and Water Watch sued Smithfield Foods for misleading consumers during the pandemic about these meat shortages and worker safety because it was trying to protect its bottom line and keep operating without sufficient worker protections. So Emily is a staff attorney on our Factory Farm campaign, and she works to combat the harmful impacts of industrial meat production on our environment, rural communities, and food system workers through litigation and legal advocacy. So Emily, will you tell us a little bit more about this lawsuit against Smithfield?
Definitely. Thanks, Kate. So as Amanda mentioned, during the early days of the pandemic, meatpacking companies were using their political power and public messaging to ensure that they could keep operating their plants at full tilt, despite the life-threatening risk it posed to their workers. And Smithfield Foods played a central role in this scheme, and consequently, their plants became epicenters for COVID outbreaks and played a big part in actually accelerating the nationwide transmission of the virus. But a lot of the claims that they were making to justify this full steam ahead approach were completely false and misleading to consumers and the public. So through our lawsuit, we're alleging that Smithfield deceived consumers and the public during this global emergency by falsely claiming that COVID-related plant closures were bringing us, quote, perilously close to the edge in terms of our meat supply. And that had the effect of stoking consumer panic and increasing demand for their products. But in reality, we were never in danger of a meat shortage. While the company was fear-mongering about domestic shortages, their foreign exports were hitting record highs. And in addition to that, the country had enough meat in cold storage warehouses to keep grocery stores stocked for many, many months. And even worse than these lies on meat shortages, Smithfield was also lying about the safety precautions it was taking to protect its workers. The company was mounting an aggressive PR campaign to assure the public that it was doing everything in its power to keep its workers safe. But actual worker accounts and government safety citations show really just the opposite, that Smithfield put its workforce at extreme risk by failing to provide adequate PPE or implement social distancing at its plants, and also fostering a work while sick culture. But more than that, it was actively working behind the scenes to weaken state and federal health regulations so that it wouldn't have to implement safety protocols that would slow down production and eat into their profits. So that's why we filed this case. We filed it last June in DC courts, and we're alleging that Smithfield's egregious profit-driven actions violated consumer protection law. So we are now at the point at which Smithfield has filed a motion asking the court to dismiss our case. They're claiming that our allegations are completely implausible and that their statements were credible and protected by the First Amendment. But unfortunately for Smithfield, the day before they filed their motion, the House of Representatives released an incredibly damning report about meatpackers' pandemic deceptions. And the report completely backs up our case. It confirms that Smithfield's meat shortage claims had, quote, no basis in fact, and that the company played a, quote, lethal role in weakening federal meatpacking worker protections. So we are looking forward to using these congressional findings in our opposition to Smithfield's motion, which we'll be filing in June. And we're confident that if we survive this motion to dismiss, we can and will hold Smithfield accountable for their deceit.
That's great. Thank you so much, Emily, for sharing that work that you and the legal team are doing to hold Smithfield accountable. And this is the type of work that our legal team does across the board to make sure that, corporations are not just working in their best interest, but that we're really looking out for people like us. So we'll share a link in the chat that has a little bit more about the Smithfield lawsuit that Emily and our legal team is working on if you're interested in diving into that a little bit deeper. So thanks so much, Emily. Let's turn back now to Emma and Amanda and talk a little bit more about the impact this consolidation has on workers. So we've heard a little bit from Emily about specifically COVID working conditions, but overall, could you just share a little bit more about how this type of consolidation is affecting grocery store employees and farm workers more broadly?
Yeah, so I touched on this a bit before, but consolidation has really just decimated the agricultural industry, leaving fewer farmers raising more hogs. Iowa lost nearly 90% of its hog farms between 1982 and 2017 because consolidation and rapid expansion of the factory farm industry drove out the smaller family scale farms. And at the same time, this system has managed to push down the real price of hogs. So today's farmers earn $2 less per pound of hog compared to 1982, while the retail price fell only $1. So large slaughterhouses, processors, and retailers could capture that other dollar. So when people are commending the efficiency and the technological advancements of this industry, what they're really praising is endeavors by big ag that have created meaningful, lasting harm on people and communities, all for the sake of corporate profits.
Yeah, and I think that kind of goes hand in hand too with what's happening with the workers and these retailers. As we've seen the rise of these corporate giants, the huge supermarket chains, and Walmart is now the leading provider of groceries in our country. 1 out of every $3 is spent on groceries goes straight to Walmart's pockets. We have also seen wages decline. We have seen what's called wage theft, which is an employer intentionally tries to cut back on your wages by preventing you from working overtime, or even preventing you from getting full-time schedules so that you can actually benefit from required benefits and such. We've seen similar things happening among slaughterhouse workers across the country. Jobs have gotten, wages have lowered, union representation has lowered, while jobs have gotten significantly more dangerous. And these are no longer necessarily living jobs that you can live off of. There was a government report looking at full-time workers and part-time workers who worked at places like Walmart and McDonald's. And we found that Walmart had the highest percentage of employees who are actually on benefits like Medicare, Medicaid, and food stamps, even though they're working people who still cannot make ends meet. And maybe they turn around and use their food stamps at Walmart because that's the only retailer left in their location.
Right. Yeah. And just to, jump off of that, being the only retailer in their location, how has this type of consolidation impacted communities' ability to access healthy food? And how has this caused what we call food deserts in certain communities?
Yeah, we've seen across the board and really in every state a significant decline in the total number of retailers. Like, we're gotten used to seeing very large grocery stores and mega markets like Super Walmart and Super Target and everything, but there's just far fewer of them. And so for many people, that means no longer having a supermarket in your neighborhood, or if you do, you only have one. So there's no competition. They can charge whatever they want to charge you. And so we're seeing what we call food apartheid, not even a food desert, but apartheid. Deliberate, systematic, red line of communities where they don't want to build a grocery store because they're going to build it where it's the most profitable. So this means there's a higher percentage of urban residents who don't live within a walking distance of a supermarket, or rural residents who might drive 10, 20 miles just to get fresh milk.
Right. That sounds exactly like what my town was like. My town was a food desert until just this February. Way back in the 90s, we had 2 grocery stores. But as the influence of big ag grew larger than the power of farmers, businesses and the people that supported them left. So by the early 2000s, my community was down to a single grocery store. And by 2020, we had no grocery store at all. I was driving 50 miles just to buy, a head of lettuce or a carton of sour cream. But fortunately, after 2 years of lobbying, begging, and incentivizing multiple regional grocers, we finally were able to open up a new grocery store this year. I don't mean to brag, but I was the second person in the store. Would have been first, but I didn't want to tackle this elderly man that was in front of me. My moral compass just said that probably wasn't okay. But to bring the store here, we had to give them land, we had to offer free sewer and water access, and a reduced tax rate. Which is just a lot just to get a grocery store. Iowa is supposed to be this proud agricultural state, and you'll often hear people say that our farmers feed the world, yet we're barely even feeding ourselves. I just don't think it should have to be this way at all. I don't think it needs to be this way, and we can change it.
Yeah, agreed, Emma. And, you and Food and Water Watch are working hard to change this, which we'll talk about soon. And, what you just shared is really striking, that, the Midwest is known as like the breadbasket of the US. So you'd expect there would be an abundance of food, in your region for local communities. But what you've just described is showing that that's not the case. And so particularly for meat production on these hog farms we've been discussing, that pork that's being produced in Iowa is being shipped and consumed by people around the country. So it's not staying locally, but something else is. So what about the impacts, environmental or otherwise, on local residents who are living near these CAFOs and factory farms?
Yeah, I mean, our food system is just so interconnected that there's hardly a sphere that it doesn't influence, particularly the environmental impacts. The environmental impacts are massive. First, this system is driving the climate crisis. Livestock alone is responsible for 14.5% of all man-made greenhouse gas emissions, and factory farms and the intensive practices used to feed and transport the animals and their waste results in emitting an unfeasible amount of greenhouse gases, even more than if we raise that same amount of livestock on pasture. Factory farms also emit numerous air pollutants, from hydrogen sulfide to particulate matter. And as a result, we've seen a rise in respiratory problems like asthma among the people who work and live near factory farms, which is basically everyone in Iowa anymore. But there's also real concerns about land use. Iowa's fertile land is used for corn and soybeans. That's basically it. But little of it is actually consumed by people. Rather, it's being used to produce cheap animal feed and ethanol. And these poor farming practices that are used to grow these crops, like monocropping and tilling, has resulted in the loss of nearly 7 inches of topsoil in less than 200 years. Being a top agricultural state under this system has made it unsustainable for Iowa to remain a leading ag state into the future. And at the same time, we were also using billions of pounds of chemical fertilizer and factory farm manure each year to provide the soil its necessary nutrients to continue growing this cheap animal feed for factory farms. And we're applying it at rates that far exceed the soil's ability to absorb it, meaning it's running off into our waterways. Over 10,000 private wells across Iowa are contaminated with runoff. Over 750 of our lakes, rivers, and streams are impaired. 200 community water systems struggle to provide clean drinking water. It's because our farming methods are designed to make a profit, not to benefit the land, the livestock, or the everyday people living here. A few months ago, actually, a docu-series called Wasteland filmed the water crisis that Iowa is enduring because of our agricultural waste. It is great, highly recommend it. It features several Food and Water Watch members and our allies, and it just provides a clear picture of how this system is destroying our communities, our environment, and our livelihoods. I am also in it, and I am expecting my Emmy any day now. It's streaming on Paramount Plus right now, but it's also going to be airing on cable later this summer. So if you check it out, just remember that the camera does add 10, let's go 30 pounds.
Thanks, Emma. Yeah, as Emma just mentioned, Wasteland is a 4-part docuseries that recently aired on Paramount Plus, and she did spend the 4th episode in Iowa meeting with Emma and other allies, talking about factory farms and the impacts on local environment and the health concerns it's posing for her community. It's a really powerful series, so I encourage you to check it out if you're interested. You do need to have a Paramount Plus subscription to access it at the moment, but as Emma said, we're hoping it'll be available more publicly later this summer. But you can also do a 7-day free trial on Paramount if you're interested in watching it now. We'll put the link in the chat where you can read more about that docuseries. All right, so now that we've talked about some of the trends that we've seen in market consolidation, how this impacts on our wallet and our health and environment, I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about a newer trend we're seeing, and that's artificial or lab-grown meat. It's something that these companies are proclaiming as a solution to many of the issues we've just discussed. And I'm sure many of the folks on this call today have, seen lots of these new meat alternatives popping up in grocery stores like Beyond Meat, Impossible Burger, Morningstar Farms products. There's lots of them out there. And Food and Water Watch has done some research into this new field. So Amanda, can you tell us a little bit about, what lab meat is?
Yeah, so lab meat really is an umbrella term for what are really 2 distinct technologies. So one still reads like a science fiction novel. It is the idea of taking stem cells from a live animal, putting them into a laboratory environment using certain additives and growth promotions and scaffolding to grow that into basically muscle meat. So the idea being that you could have a hamburger that the cells originated from a cow on a farm, but way back, and raising animals within a laboratory setting. So the idea being like a no-kill burger. But this is, like I said, still very much in the theory, and there isn't a whole lot of evidence that this is actually could by any means scale up into to the level that we would need to replace the amount of meat that people do eat. And right now, the only place it's available is in Singapore. Singapore's food authority is the only regulatory body that's ever given a green light to this. And there's like one exclusive club in Singapore. If next time you're there, if you want to pay $23 for some no-kill chicken nuggets, you can try them out. So that one, we're not even sure if that's going to be a thing. The other one, though, is very common and has been around for a while, and we're seeing a resurgence in brands, and that would be plant-based meat. So this is, entirely plant-based, quote unquote, products that have no animal products in whatsoever. And again, the goal of this is to really kind of bring current meat lovers on board. So it's not just a veggie burger that tastes like beans and lentils, but it's, an Impossible burger or a Beyond burger that uses plant additives, highly processed, to mimic the taste and the texture that people are familiar with meat. So we're seeing, things that more closely resemble sausages, even milk and cheese and all these different things, quote unquote plant-based. But what make them, it's a lot different than, just simply making a veggie burger at home. There's not a lot of money to be made off of that by corporate America. And so the idea is, again, kind of selling us this ready to eat off the supermarket shelf product that could replace meat in people's diets. But those, like I mentioned, are very highly processed. So the idea of them being plant-based, yes, they eventually do come from plants, but at the same time, through lots of different additives, rather than, a whole plant ingredient.
Yeah, so it sounds like from what you're saying, there's not really much evidence to support, the healthiness of these products like they would want to lead us to believe.
Yeah. When it comes to lab meat, especially, we just don't know what's happening with these technologies. These are developed, when I'm talking about the cell cultured meat within laboratories, developed by private companies who are interested in making money off of this. And we don't even have, I could speak an hour about the fact that we don't have the regulatory tools in the US to even, consider all of the health and safety concerns that we have. One concern alone is the fact that cell cultured meat grown in a lab requires high use of sterile, equipment and possibly even antibiotics. We don't know if that residue is carried over to the end meat. We know that inducing cells to grow in this rapid way is very similar to the way that cancer cells grow, which is that meat going to be like consuming cancer cells? We don't know. We don't know the health and safety risks, and we haven't caught up, and we don't even have the regulatory bandwidth right now to even give these the attention that they would need before they could even be commercially available. When it comes to plant-based meat, however, we have a lot of information on why processed food is bad for you. All you have to do is take that, the fancy label and all the advertising, turn it around, look at that food label and tell me how many ingredients you actually recognize, right? These are ultra processed foods, and dietitians and medical people have really been sounding the alarm lately on the problems with ultra processed foods within our diets. All the food additives, they're very highly reliant on things like saturated fats and even sugars just to make them palatable, right? And aside from that too, we're just beginning to understand the impacts of, processed diets on the microbiome within our guts. We're just beginning to understand that so many, human illnesses might even be tied to just an imbalance in our guts, which ultra processed foods really do mess with.
Yeah. And, another thing about this too, is just given what we just heard about how destructive CAFOs can be to our environment in terms of pollution and animal waste and other chemicals from runoff, it would be natural to assume that, foregoing animal meat in favor of plant-based meat would be better for the environment. And I think that's something that these companies like to play up to market themselves and appeal to people like us who are concerned about sustainability. But they're not really telling the full story, is my understanding. So what are some of the environmental impacts that you're aware of lab-grown and plant-based meat that we should know about?
Yeah, when it comes to cell culture meat, this is all very speculative because we do not have this by any means scaled up to the system where we can actually gauge, is it more sustainable? But you think about a laboratory environment, we're not talking just a manufacturing assembly line. We're talking very similar to what is used in the biopharmaceutical industry. So the amount of chemicals and energy needed to run these plants and to run them in a sterile environment is pretty intense, enough that a few studies have looked into what the potential life cycle analysis would be, looking at the carbon footprint from the beginning to the end of these products, and they might even be bigger than beef. So we're talking huge climate footprints because they are so energy intensive. Even theoretically, if these plant-based meat alternatives, the ones that are truly made of plants, although again, plant components, processed ingredients, even if they, theoretically had a lower carbon footprint, they still depend on the very same systems that that Emma mentioned happening in Iowa: overproduction of corn, overproduction of soybeans, oftentimes on monocultures, fed with chemical inputs. And so it's not fixing the problem. You're not just having more options at the retail shelf is not going to change the power systems that really created this system in the first place.
Yeah. So, speaking of that, existing system and who is currently benefiting from it, what do we know about who is right now investing in these types of products and who the major players are in continuing to develop out this market?
Yeah, so already the plant-based meat market, again, the ones that are right now commercially available, is highly consolidated. About 3 out of every $4 that we spend go to just 4 companies, which is very huge. Only one of those is a newer company, Beyond Meat. And they only got started because they had a huge amount of investment, millions and millions of dollars from people as wide-ranging as Bill Gates and Snoop Dogg, and even Tyson Foods. So yes, Tyson Foods, who makes pork and chicken and beef, right? And so the goal of these companies is really not to change the system again, right? And we're also seeing, like I mentioned, a lot of investment by big meat. So there are now private labels and acquisitions and investment in cellular technology by the big 4 meat companies, because they see this as a competition. And so their mantra is, if we can't beat them, join them. That actually came straight from an investor call from one of the big companies. The idea being that, well, we want to be the center of the plate. Whether you're buying a plant-based burger or a beef burger, you're going to be buying from one of the big 4. So again, you might think that you are voting with your dollar when you go to the supermarket and you choose that plant-based sausage versus pork sausage, but that same dollar could be lining the very same pockets.
And, at Food and Water Watch, that's something that we are trying to do, is we're trying to move that needle. We're trying to work to change this system. And so that's why, we have been building a movement and gathering support for legislation that will overhaul our food and farm system. And we actually just got some really exciting news on that front earlier today. Emma, do you want to do the honors and share the news with our audience here?
I sure do, but first I just gotta set up the scene here. So let's see. Too much. Okay. No, we'll just get
it's a big deal.
One of our top federal priorities has been moving a critical bill through Congress, and it was just introduced today. It's known as the Merger Moratorium Bill, and Senators Booker, Tester, Merkley, and Warren released it right before we hopped on Zoom. The bill will halt mega mergers like the one we saw between Bayer and Monsanto a few years ago, to essentially address the consolidation and monopolization of our food system. So this would drastically improve the state of our food system. So I really encourage folks to read more about it, talk to your members of Congress, and keep an eye on Food and Water Watch, because we'll be releasing even more ways that you can take action to get this legislation passed in the coming weeks.
Awesome. Yeah, and this news is...
I almost forgot.
We are very excited about the introduction of this bill, and you all are the first to hear about it today, because as Emma said, we just got this news right before this call, so we don't even have a press release out about it yet, because the news hasn't made it that far, but we will have more details, a press release, actions that you can take that we'll share in some follow-up emails after this event. So yeah, great work to everyone who has been involved in this movement and helping us get this legislation introduced. And so now the next step will be to mobilize behind it and make sure that we get it passed. So, on that front, there are some other really important opportunities ahead of us in addition to this merger moratorium bill. So Emma, do you want to share more about what some of the other things are that we're working on and how people here can get involved in those?
Absolutely. So we are working to confront this issue on all sides and on all levels, from local, state, and federal to on-the-ground organizing, legal work, and policy changes. So you already heard from Emily about some of the legal work we're up to, but we're also pushing for other legislation in Congress, including the Farm System Reform Act, which would begin the transition to a better food and farm system by strengthening the Packers and Stockyard Act, helping farmers shift outside of the factory farm model, and reinstating country of origin labeling, and so much more. We could do an entire event just on that. I'm sure we have. We also have a lot of robust state level campaigns, particularly in Iowa, Oregon, and Delaware. In Iowa here, we've been fighting really hard to ban factory farms. Our staff in Oregon are working to stop mega dairies. And in Delaware, we are leading the charge against factory farm biogas, which is where they take the manure from factory farms and convert it into methane. I don't want to give any of my colleagues a big head, but they're pretty fantastic, and could always use more people on the ground fighting the good fight, because the more people we have with us, the more power we have. So it's my personal and professional recommendation that you reach out to them by email, on Facebook, Mobilize, fax machine, 2 tin cans and a piece of string. However, if you're interested in getting involved.
Yeah, there are a lot of ways that you can get engaged in this work. A really good place to start is what Emma just mentioned, Mobilize, which is our online volunteer hub, where you can see a list of upcoming trainings, actions, educational events happening around the country. So you can search there for things happening near you, or you can join national virtual opportunities. So we'll drop a link to that in the chat for you now. I encourage you to check it out. And there are 2 upcoming volunteer opportunities in particular that I'll call out. One is a virtual meeting led by our colleagues in Oregon, talking with some experts about how mega dairies are impacting the climate crisis. And that's happening tomorrow, actually. And then the next one is happening at the end of this month on the 31st. It's our monthly central volunteer meeting, which is just a great way to plug into different actions that you can take to support this work. So again, I encourage you to check out Mobilize for some of those upcoming opportunities. And then Amanda, is there anything that you'd like to share about opportunities we have to reshape our food system?
Yeah, so we are just now embarking on negotiations for the very next Farm Bill. So the Farm Bill, if you're not aware of it, comes out about every 5 years. The current one is set to expire in 2023. And this impacts every single one of us, whether or not you have ever stepped on a farm in your life. It really, dictates what we grow and how we produce it, and who has access to food. And so this is really an opportunity to fight back against all this dismantling by corporations through the centuries. The first Farm Bill actually came out during the New Deal, and it was designed to help control, the supply of grains, because farmers were facing issues of overproduction, and that really dropped their prices. So we have these programs in place that were really wonderful and helped to guarantee fixed prices for many farmers. Those were decimated in the 80s and 90s, but it's really an opportunity to put those back on the table. Also, there's a ton of dark money that goes into the Farm Bill, lots and lots of lobbying by corporations for their own interests. So there's opportunities to close some of the loopholes that have been put in by corporate farming over the last few decades. Loopholes that, for instance, incentivize factory farm growth and such. So this is really a time when we really need to be engaged, and Food and Water Watch definitely wants to be part of this conversation. But the other really big thing generally, and the Farm Bill can do some of this as well by really increasing funding to help grow our regional food systems. I think people really woke up to this fact during the pandemic. We saw, as mentioned before, again, the closure of large slaughterhouses, but smaller local slaughterhouses thrived largely throughout the pandemic because they had an influx of people interested not only in local meat, but also in smaller farmers who didn't have access to the big slaughterhouses anymore. And so really, how do we rebuild these localized systems, ones that Emma mentioned in terms of local grocery stores, local hog auctions, local, farmers markets, everything that we need to really connect eaters to farmers in their area. I mean, the reality, like Emma said, is just like my reality growing up in North Dakota. We grew an immense amount of food, breadbasket of the world, and we never ate anything we grew ourselves because the supply chains were so huge. So we've learned through the pandemic that smaller and more localized supply chains are in fact more resilient and do circulate that money into local economies. So we need to be very intentional about promoting and building those.
Awesome. Thank you both. We'll put a link in the chat for a report called Well Fed, a roadmap to a sustainable food system that works for all. And that really dives in more to what Amanda was just talking about ways that we can, sort of recreate these local regionalized supply chains. All right, so thank you both so much. We do have a little bit of time now for audience Q&A. So I'll take a look now at some of the questions that have come in, and if anybody on the call has a question that you haven't submitted yet, please use the Q&A box to send that in now. So let's go to one of our first questions. Amanda, maybe you could take a stab at this one. Does food consolidation have anything to do with what we've been hearing about the baby formula shortage in recent weeks?
Absolutely. And thankfully, it's getting really covered under this narrative. It's, unfortunately, we don't think much about consolidation until, the rug is pulled out under our feet, like we saw again during the pandemic, during right now, the Ukrainian invasion and the wheat prices going up, but especially in baby formula. That is one of the most highly consolidated industries that we have. 95% of baby formula sales in the US go to one of three companies. So we start to worry about consolidation when the top four companies take in 40 to 50%. But when you have three companies that make up 95% of sales, and unfortunately, Abbott is one of the biggest ones, and they had a single plant close down. One plant in Michigan closed down, and that took out its entirety of baby formula across the country. I mean, parents are struggling. We're not talking about soda, we're not talking about chips, we're not even talking about milk or meat. We're talking about formula that feeds infants who can't eat anything else, including preemies. And so this is a huge problem. You think about if we hadn't enabled these corporations to get so large, and we did enable them. I mean, there's a complicated history of, special deals given to these companies through USDA feeding programs that really became the exclusive suppliers to mothers in need. But going on beyond all that, if we hadn't allowed these companies to get so big, the closure of one plant would not be causing, the panic and the crisis that we would see all across the country.
Thank you. Yeah, and something that you just mentioned in your answer leads into another question that we have from Susan. How do government subsidies play into the consolidation that we've seen happen in our food system?
Are you taking that one, Amanda, or mine?
If you want to, you can. I can start. I'll start with. I'll kind of pick up the baby formula thing. So there's a program called the Women, Infants, and Children's Program that started in the 70s. Very important program. The idea is it's similar to food stamps, but aimed towards mothers and mothers of young children, providing things like milk and other staples that children need to thrive. And baby formula is one thing that is covered under there. But when that program started and these contracts that I mentioned, exclusive contracts, were given to these big corporations, they actually jacked up the price of formula by a lot because they had this guaranteed buyer with the US government. And similar to that, formula is inelastic demand, right? You don't demand more formula just because you're having a good year. You might demand more iPhones, right? If you're having a good year, but people need to eat, right? And babies need to eat. So that's definitely tied in there as well.
Great, thank you. All right, let's see. Our next question is, what can we do to combat the narrative that wanting a better system of agriculture is anti-farmer?
Oh boy, that's a good one. I think, but first we need to recognize what we're up against, right? We are up against a multi-billion-dollar industry that has been producing propaganda for decades. So that's, how this narrative began. And to shut it down, essentially it's telling the truth. We know that this system isn't working. It's not working for our farmers. It's not working for our communities. It's not working for our businesses or our environment. What it really comes down to is the fact that these companies that have shoved farmers out of business, that have taken, monopolized the wealth within the agricultural industry, are anti-farmer. They're not fighting for farmers. They're fighting for their own private profits. And so when we keep pushing that narrative, we put our own out there. I think that's the beginning step to ending this anti-farmer nonsense, just because we don't like the system, the food and farm system we have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so we have a question from John. What is the alternative to consolidation in food suppliers, and how could we encourage it? And there are a number of people. Rose followed up on something like this as well. A few people have asked similar questions of, what is the alternative and how can we help?
I think it's important to remember that we haven't been here for very long, right? We're talking about massive changes in the last 30, 40 years, especially within even the last decade or two, right? So we have had systems where communities like Emma's and communities where I grew up and had ample grocery stores, had connections to their local farmers. My great-grandfather owned the local grocery store in town, and he sourced cattle from his neighbors. Those connections can be made. And so really it is, are alternatives that we know, and really the economic data supports there are even more beneficial to communities, whether or not agriculture is your industry, because those dollars again are spent locally. So there are alternatives, and they are really a win-win-win for everyone except corporate America. Sorry.
I think it goes back to what we talked about earlier. It's just we need to quit overproducing corn and beans that we're not even eating, that are going to other products. Our land should be used to grow food for people, not these other uses.
Yeah, and following up on a question that just came through too, I mean, there is a worry that, if we go to more regional food systems, would they be more vulnerable, right? If you don't have this massive supply chain and there's a drought in one part of the country, I mean, what's going to happen? But following up on what Emma said, we used to have baked into our system was this issue again that I mentioned of supply management. And part of the key cornerstones of that was keeping grains in reserve. We don't do that anymore, right? And when we go back thousands of years to biblical times and we talked about supply management in Egypt, this is not a new concept. And the idea being that in years when there's overproduction, rather than letting that flood the market and prices drop, government can buy that, can store storable commodities like grains. And then in years where there are leaner times, you can release that back into the market. So there actually is, within these more localized systems, there's opportunity too, to kind of, play our cards right and to have reserves for years when, those disasters do happen.
Yeah, that's a great point, and I think leads into what might be our final question is, is it up to us as consumers to change this system? It sounds like, there's a lot of regulation that needs to happen. There's a lot of protection that needs to be put into place. So wondering if you have any final thoughts on that.
I can start. I would say it's up to us as voters to change the system, and as good as citizens who, no matter what side of the aisle you're on, you talk to your representatives and you make your voice heard. Again, it kind of goes back to the lab meat problem. It's not a problem we can solve our way out of. We don't have nearly the wealth that these mega corporations have. And, even going back to the example of Smithfield in this case of, there was a huge supply chain issues during the pandemic and the industry was still exporting meat abroad. We could all go vegan in the United States, but there's no guarantee that that would stop the production of livestock on factory farms, because that's baked into our system. So, eat consciously if you can afford it, but at the same time, vote with your vote.
Great, thank you. Yeah, and we'll definitely share some resources in the follow-up email with ways that you can get in touch with your member of Congress about things like the Farm System Reform Act, the new merger moratorium, and just ways that you can make sure that your elected officials are hearing from you as one of their constituents. So before we wrap up, I just want to ask Amanda, Emma, if either of you have any final thoughts you want to share with the audience today.
I'd like to know why you didn't ask my absolutely not planted question about how I got to be so cool, but that's fine. We'll save that for another time. But no, I really just want to thank folks for coming and hope we can all work together soon to continue changing this system that we have now.
Yeah, and ditto what Emma said. I mean, just the first part of it is having this conversation and being aware of the problem, and then going out and telling your neighbors and spreading the word and doing what you can. So thank you for being here.